The night my husband of 35 years left me, it was raining so hard that the windows rattled like something was trying to get inside the house. Robert stood in the middle of our living room with a suitcase in his hand and a look on his face I barely recognized. "I can't live like this anymore, Kathleen," he said coldly. "I'm tired of being the only one with ambition. I deserve a better life than this. Than you." He told me he had met someone else, someone younger, someone successful. What he didn't know was that the woman he was leaving me for worked at a company I owned, and he thought I was poor. Before I tell you how everything fell apart that night and what happened when the truth finally came out, let me ask you something. If someone you loved for decades suddenly walked away because they believed you had nothing, what would you do? If this story already makes your heart race a little, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this journey. And I'm curious, where are you watching from today? What time is it in your city right now? Leave a comment and tell me. Trust me, this story is only beginning. 35 years is a long time to love someone, long enough to build a life, long enough to forget who you were before that person walked into it, long enough to believe that no matter what storms came, the two of you would face them together. I met Robert Thompson when I was 23 years old. Back then, life felt wide open and hopeful. I had just moved to Chicago after graduating from a small college in Illinois. I worked as a receptionist in a construction office, answering phones and filing invoices while trying to figure out what my future was supposed to look like. Robert was 25 and already working as a subcontractor. He wasn't rich, but he had a kind of confidence that made people believe he would be someday. He had broad shoulders, an easy smile, and a way of talking about the future, like it was something he could shape with his own hands. I still remember the first conversation we had. I was sitting behind the reception desk one afternoon when he walked in wearing dusty work boots and holding a stack of blueprints. "Excuse me," he said, leaning against the counter. "Is Mr. Sanders in?" "He's in a meeting," I told him politely. Robert sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Figures," he said. "I've been chasing that man all week." I laughed softly. "You're not the only one." He glanced at the paperwork spread across my desk. "You look like the only organized person in this building," he said. It was such an unexpected compliment that I felt my cheeks warm. "Trust me," I replied. "That's not a very high standard here." That was how it started. Nothing dramatic, no lightning bolts, just a small conversation between two young people who were still trying to find their place in the world. A few weeks later, he asked me out for coffee. By the end of that year, we were inseparable. Robert had big dreams. He didn't want to work for other contractors forever. He wanted to build something of his own. "Someday," he told me one night while we sat on the hood of his truck overlooking Lake Michigan, "I'm going to start my own construction company. Real projects, real buildings." His voice carried the kind of certainty that made it impossible not to believe him. "And when that happens," he said, turning to me with a grin, "you're going to be my partner." "Your business partner," I teased. "No," he said softly. "My wife." We got married 2 years later. The early years weren't easy. Robert worked long hours on construction sites while I took bookkeeping classes at night. When he finally launched his first small construction business, it wasn't because we had investors or connections. It was because we had savings. And those savings mostly came from me. I worked 2 jobs for almost 3 years. During the day, I handled accounting for a local supply company. At night, I helped Robert with invoices, permits, and paperwork for his growing business. Many evenings, we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by receipts and contracts. Robert would run his hands through his hair and say, "I don't know how you keep all this straight." I would smile and tap the calculator. Because someone has to. Slowly, the company began to grow. Small renovation projects turned into larger contracts, a couple of apartment buildings, then a commercial warehouse renovation. For a while, it felt like we were building something together. When our son Michael was born, I stepped back from working outside the home. Robert insisted that the company was finally stable enough. "You've done more than enough already," he told me. "Let me take it from here." I believed him. And for many years, life looked exactly like the dream we had imagined. Robert's company expanded. We bought a modest house in the suburbs. Michael grew up playing baseball in the backyard, while Robert grilled hamburgers on summer evenings. From the outside, we looked like a perfectly normal American family. But success has a strange way of changing people. At first, the changes were subtle. Robert began traveling more for work. He talked constantly about new opportunities, new deals, new investors. Money became the center of every conversation. How much is this project worth? How much did that contractor charge? How much profit did we lose on that job? I tried to remind him of the early days. Do you remember when we used to celebrate just finishing a project, I asked once? Robert laughed dismissively. That was when we were small, Kathy. This is different now. He was right about one thing. Things were different. About 10 years ago, Robert made a series of risky investments that nearly destroyed everything we had built. A commercial development project collapsed when the developer filed for bankruptcy. Several contractors never got paid, including Robert's company. Within a year, the business was drowning in debt. I remember the night he told me. Robert sat at the kitchen table staring at a stack of financial statements. "We're in serious trouble," he said quietly. "How bad?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Bad enough that we might lose everything." For weeks, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Creditors called constantly. Letters arrived in the mail demanding payments we couldn't make. Robert became distant and irritable. What he never realized was that I had already started looking for solutions. A few months before the crisis, my mother had passed away and left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't enough to solve all of Robert's financial problems, but it was enough to start something new. Instead of telling him about the money, I used it quietly. I began investing in small properties. Nothing glamorous at first. A rundown duplex on the south side of Chicago, an old rental house that needed repairs, a small retail space in a struggling neighborhood. I renovated them slowly, managing contractors myself and learning everything I could about real estate investment. Over time, those small investments started generating steady income. I never told Robert how much. At the time, I believed I was protecting his pride. He was already struggling with the collapse of his business. The last thing I wanted was for him to feel like his wife had become the primary provider. So when Robert asked how we were still managing to pay certain bills, I shrugged and said my small online craft store had been doing surprisingly well. He didn't question it. In fact, he barely paid attention. To him, it was just another one of Kathleen's harmless little hobbies. He never imagined that those little hobbies would grow into something far bigger than either of us expected. And he certainly never imagined that one day the success I built quietly in the background would completely change the story he believed about me. At the time, though, I still believed we were on the same team. I thought we were simply going through a difficult chapter. I never imagined that years later, the man I had supported for more than 3 decades would look at me with cold disappointment and say the words that would end our marriage. "You're holding me back." If only Robert had known the truth back then, everything that happened later might have been very different. If you had asked me 10 years ago whether my husband would one day leave me because he believed I was a failure, I would have laughed. Not because Robert was perfect. He wasn't. None of us are. But because for most of our marriage, we had been a team. Or at least, I believed we were. The truth is, the collapse of Robert's construction company changed something inside him that never fully healed. At first, he was simply exhausted. Anyone would have been. Losing a business you built with your own hands feels like losing a part of yourself. For months after the bankruptcy, Robert barely spoke. He would sit at the kitchen table late at night, staring at spreadsheets and unpaid invoices. Sometimes I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and find the lights still on downstairs. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating much either. "What are you doing up?" I asked him once as I walked into the kitchen. He didn't look up from the papers. Trying to figure out how everything went wrong, I poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward him. "Things will get better," I said gently. He gave a bitter laugh. "That's easy for you to say." At the time, I thought he meant I was trying to comfort him. I didn't realize he meant something else entirely. Over the next year, Robert took several consulting jobs for other construction companies. None of them paid what he used to earn when his own business was thriving. That reality gnawed at him. I could see it every time he checked his phone or scrolled through news about former competitors who were now running successful developments. Meanwhile, my quiet real estate investments were slowly growing. The first duplex I bought started bringing in reliable rental income. Then the small retail space I renovated attracted a coffee shop tenant. A year later, I purchased another property, then another. I learned quickly. Real estate was different from Robert's construction business in one important way. Patience mattered more than speed. Instead of chasing massive deals, I focused on steady growth. I spent hours studying property markets, zoning laws, renovation budgets, and tenant contracts. I built relationships with contractors, lawyers, and property managers. Slowly, the income began to multiply. But inside our house, none of that was visible. To Robert, my days looked simple. I worked from my laptop. I occasionally met with craft suppliers or online clients. I kept the house organized and helped Michael with college applications. Robert rarely asked questions. When he did, it was usually with mild curiosity. "So your little craft business still doing okay?" he asked one evening while watching television. "Better than expected," I replied. "Good," he said absent-mindedly. And that was the end of the conversation. He never asked for numbers, never asked about clients, never asked what exactly I was selling. Looking back, I think part of him simply didn't care. The idea that Kathleen, his quiet, supportive wife, might actually be building something significant never crossed his mind. About 6 years ago, my investments reached a point where I needed a more formal business structure. Managing multiple properties under my personal name was becoming complicated. So I created a company, not under the name Thompson, under my maiden name, Hale, Kathleen Hale. The company began as a small real estate investment group. Eventually, it grew into something larger, Hale and Parker Property Group. The Parker part came later when I partnered with a talented property development attorney named Daniel Parker. He helped structure the company legally and expand into commercial properties. By that point, I had already purchased several apartment buildings and small office complexes. For the first time in my life, I felt something new. Confidence. Not the loud, showy kind Robert always chased, but a quiet certainty that I could stand on my own. Still, I kept my success private. Some people might find that strange. Why hide something you worked so hard to build? The answer is simple. Robert's pride had become fragile. The bankruptcy had wounded him deeply, and every time someone mentioned money or success, I could see the tension in his shoulders. If he discovered that his wife, who he believed was running a harmless little online craft store, had quietly built a thriving real estate company, I wasn't sure how he would react. So I stayed silent. I told myself I was protecting our marriage. But over the years, something else began to happen. Robert started changing. The frustration he once directed at failed business deals slowly turned toward me. At first, it was small comments. "You're lucky you don't have to deal with real financial pressure," he said once. Another time, he joked with friends at a dinner party. "Kathleen's job is basically shopping and crafts." Everyone laughed, including me. But inside, the words stung. Because by that point, my company owned properties worth several $1,000,000. And yet, in Robert's eyes, I was still the woman who stayed home and played with hobbies. I told myself it didn't matter. Marriage isn't a competition. But the comments continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes cruel. "You've never really understood ambition," he said during one argument. "I supported your ambition for 30 years, I replied quietly. He waved his hand dismissively. That was different. Different. That word stayed with me. Then about 2 years ago, Robert began coming home later and later. At first he said it was work, new consulting projects, networking events, client meetings. But eventually the signs became impossible to ignore. The sudden attention to his appearance, new shirts, expensive cologne, text messages that made him smile while staring at his phone. I didn't confront him immediately, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because after 35 years of marriage, you sometimes hope your instincts are wrong. I remember the night everything finally became clear. Robert came home unusually cheerful. He poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen counter. "I met someone interesting today," he said casually. "Someone from work?" I asked. "Sort of." He took a sip of whiskey. "She's young, smart, works in marketing for a real estate firm." I felt a strange chill run through me. "What's her name?" "Emily Parker." At the time, the name meant nothing to me. But a few months later, when Robert packed his suitcase and told me he deserved a better life, that same name returned. And not long after that night, I opened the employee directory at Hale and Parker Property Group. That was when I saw it. Emily Parker, marketing manager. Employee ID 44127. Working at a company majority owned by Kathleen Hale. The woman my husband believed had no ambition. The woman he believed had nothing. The woman he had just left. After I saw Emily Parker's name in our employee directory, I closed my laptop and sat very still. For a few minutes, I didn't move at all. 35 years of marriage had just ended, and somehow the woman Robert chose to replace me was working inside the company I had spent nearly a decade building. If life were a movie, that moment would have felt dramatic. But the truth was quieter. It felt strange, almost surreal. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, trying to organize the thoughts racing through my mind. Emily Parker, marketing manager. Hale & Parker Property Group. The coincidence felt almost unbelievable, but after checking her personnel file again, there was no doubt. She'd been hired 2 years earlier, long before Robert ever mentioned her name to me, which meant something important. Emily hadn't joined the company because of Robert. Robert had entered her life later. That realization calmed me slightly. At least she hadn't intentionally targeted my marriage. Still, the situation was complicated. Very complicated. I opened her file again the next morning from my office. Our headquarters occupied 3 floors of a renovated brick building in downtown Chicago. The space had exposed steel beams, polished concrete floors, and tall windows that overlooked the river. Most employees believed the company was primarily run by my business partner, Daniel Parker. Daniel was charismatic, confident, and very comfortable speaking publicly about the company. I preferred something different: privacy. Only a small group of executives knew that I was the majority shareholder and founder. Inside the company, I was known simply as Kathleen Hale, not Kathleen Thompson. The name difference had started as a practical decision. Hale was my maiden name, and using it helped separate my business life from my personal one. But over time, it became something more than that. It allowed me to build something that belonged entirely to me, something independent of Robert. That morning, I studied Emily's performance reports carefully. She had joined the company as a junior marketing analyst and quickly climbed the ladder. Her supervisors described her as intelligent, energetic, and extremely driven. Exceptional leadership potential, one review stated. Another described her as one of the most ambitious employees in the department. Her most recent campaign had increased occupancy rates across several commercial properties by nearly 15%. Impressive, very impressive. If I hadn't known anything about her personal life, I would have considered her one of our most promising employees. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline outside my office window. The situation raised a question I hadn't expected to face. Should I tell her the truth? Technically, I had every right to. Robert and I were already separated. There was no legal reason to hide anything from Emily, but another part of me hesitated. What exactly would I say? Hello, Emily. I'm your boss, and I'm also the woman your fiancé just left after 35 years of marriage. The conversation would be humiliating for everyone involved, and something inside me resisted the idea of turning the company into a stage for my personal life. No, I decided to remain silent, at least for now. Later that week, I attended the company's quarterly leadership meeting. About 20 department heads sat around the long conference table. Daniel Parker stood near the presentation screen discussing expansion plans for several new development projects. Halfway through the meeting, the marketing team presented their latest campaign results. Emily Parker was among them. It was the first time I'd seen her in person. She looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s. She had dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail and carried herself with the kind of confident posture that usually comes from years of believing in your own potential. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and connected her laptop to the projector. Her voice was steady and clear. Our goal this quarter was to reposition several underperforming commercial spaces in emerging neighborhoods, she explained while clicking through slides. The strategy was smart. Targeted digital marketing, partnerships with small business incubators, incentives for local entrepreneurs. I watched her carefully, not with anger, not even with resentment, mostly with curiosity. This was the woman Robert believed represented the better life he deserved. When the presentation ended, several executives applauded. Daniel nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Emily." "Thank you," she replied. As the meeting wrapped up, people began gathering their laptops and coffee cups. Emily walked toward the door with the rest of the marketing team. Just before leaving, she glanced toward the head of the table where I was sitting. Our eyes met for a brief moment. She smiled politely. "Good to see you again, Kathleen." Her tone was friendly and professional. There was absolutely no recognition in her expression, no hint that she had any idea who I really was. And why would she? To her, I was simply one of the company's senior executives, not the woman whose husband she had fallen in love with. That evening, I returned to the quiet house Robert and I had shared for decades. His absence still felt strange. The bedroom closet was half empty now. The bathroom counter had lost the clutter of his shaving kit and cologne bottles. 35 years of routines don't disappear easily. I made myself dinner and sat alone at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed. A text message from my son Michael. Dad says he's getting serious with someone. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then another message appeared. Her name's Emily. He seems really happy. Michael didn't know the full story yet. He only knew that his parents were separating and that his father had met someone new. I typed a short reply. I hope he knows what he's doing. Michael responded almost immediately. Dad says it's time for a fresh start. I set the phone down without answering. Fresh start. It was amazing how easily people could rewrite history when it suited them. Robert's version of events probably sounded simple. An aging man leaving an unmotivated wife to pursue a happier future. But reality was more complicated. Much more complicated. And soon, whether Robert liked it or not, the truth about my life and the company I built was going to collide directly with his new relationship. I just didn't know yet how dramatic that collision would be. At that moment, one thing was certain. Emily Parker had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman she smiled at during meetings was the same woman her fiancé had just walked away from. For the first few weeks after discovering Emily worked at my company, I kept my distance. Not because I was afraid of her, and not because I felt threatened. The truth was simpler. I needed time to think. Divorce after 35 years isn't something you process overnight. Even when the marriage has already begun to crumble, the final break leaves a strange emptiness behind. Every morning, I still woke up automatically at 6, the same way I had for decades. Robert used to leave early for job sites, and I had always gotten up to make coffee before he left. Now the kitchen was quiet. Too quiet. At first, I tried to fill the silence with work. I spent longer hours at the office reviewing property acquisitions and development proposals. Hale and Parker Property Group had grown into a complex operation. We owned residential apartment buildings, office complexes, and retail spaces across Chicago and several nearby suburbs. Our property management division handled hundreds of tenants. Growth created responsibility, and responsibility created long days. But even during those busy days, Emily Parker's name appeared often. Her department had become one of the most active in the company. One afternoon, Daniel Parker knocked on my office door. "Got a minute?" he asked. Daniel had been my business partner for nearly 6 years. He was one of the few people who knew both sides of my life, the private woman who had quietly built a real estate empire, and the wife whose husband had just walked out after 3.5 decades. "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk. Daniel sat down and placed a folder on the table. I wanted to talk about the marketing department. I opened the folder and immediately saw Emily's name among the reports. "Her campaign numbers are impressive," Daniel continued. "She's been driving a lot of traffic to our newer properties." "I noticed," I said. Daniel studied my face carefully. "You've been unusually quiet about her." I looked up. "About who?" "Emily Parker." Daniel leaned back slightly. "I know what's going on at home, Kathleen. You don't have to pretend I don't." Daniel had been one of the first people I told when Robert left. Not because I needed sympathy, but because our company required transparency between partners. If something in my personal life had the potential to affect business decisions, Daniel needed to know. "I'm not pretending," I said calmly. "I'm just making sure personal emotions don't interfere with company operations." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk." He tapped the folder lightly. "The marketing department is recommending Emily for a promotion." I raised an eyebrow. "Already. She's been outperforming most of the senior staff," Daniel explained. "If we move forward with the River District redevelopment project, we'll need someone strong leading marketing." The River District project was one of the largest developments our company had ever attempted. 3 renovated warehouses along the Chicago River would be converted into mixed-use commercial spaces. Offices, restaurants, retail boutiques. Marketing the project would be critical. "You think she's ready?" I asked. Daniel shrugged. "Technically, yes." Then he hesitated. "But the situation with Robert complicates things." I closed the folder slowly. "What situation?" Daniel gave me a look that suggested I wasn't fooling anyone. "Your ex-husband is engaged to one of our employees," he said gently. "That's a potential conflict of interest." "Only if I allow it to become one," I replied. "And will you?" I stood and walked toward the large window behind my desk. The Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon glass towers, reflecting the afternoon sun. For years, this view had reminded me of everything I had built quietly, piece by piece. I turned back toward Daniel. Emily earned her position through performance, I said, not through personal relationships. Daniel watched me carefully. You're sure you're comfortable with that? I didn't build this company by making emotional decisions. There was a brief silence. Finally, Daniel nodded. Fair enough. He stood up and gathered the folder. I'll move forward with the promotion review. As he reached the door, he paused. One more thing. Yes. I met Robert once, remember, at that charity dinner 2 years ago. I nodded. Robert had attended reluctantly. At the time, he had no idea he was meeting executives from the company his wife secretly owned. Daniel smiled slightly. He had no idea who you were back then? No, I said quietly. He didn't. After Daniel left, I sat at my desk for a long time thinking about the strange twists life sometimes creates. Robert believed he had escaped a dull marriage and stepped into a more exciting future. A younger woman. A fresh start. What he didn't realize was that his new life was already connected to mine in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, my assistant stopped me near the elevator. Emily Parker asked if you might have a few minutes tomorrow, she said. For what? She wants to discuss a new marketing strategy for the River District project. Of course she did. If she was hoping to lead that project, presenting ideas directly to senior leadership would be the logical step. Schedule it, I said. The next afternoon, Emily walked into my office carrying a laptop and a stack of notes. Thank you for meeting with me, Miss Hale, she said politely. Please, I replied. Kathleen is fine. She smiled. Thank you, Kathleen. As she set up her presentation, I studied her more carefully than I had during the conference meeting. There was an energy about her. Not arrogance, ambition. The same kind of ambition Robert used to have when we were young. I've been analyzing market trends around the River District redevelopment, Emily began. For the next 20 minutes, she walked me through a detailed plan involving digital campaigns, local business partnerships, and targeted social media advertising. The strategy was thoughtful and surprisingly sophisticated. When she finished, she looked up at me expectantly. What do you think? I leaned back slightly. It's a strong proposal. Her face brightened. Really? Yes. You clearly understand the demographic we're trying to reach. Emily exhaled with relief. I've been working on this for weeks. She began packing up her laptop, but then hesitated. Can I ask you something a little personal? I nodded cautiously. Of course. Emily smiled sheepishly. My fiancé always says I work too much. Your fiancé, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Robert Thompson, she said proudly. My heartbeat remained steady. And what does Robert do? I asked. He used to run a construction company, she explained. Now he consults on development projects. Interesting. Robert had never mentioned consulting for real estate developers. Emily continued talking. He's been through a lot recently, she said. A difficult marriage, a wife who never really understood his drive. For the first time in the entire conversation, a sharp feeling passed through my chest, but my expression remained calm. I'm sure relationships can be complicated, I said. Emily nodded sympathetically. He says he spent years feeling trapped. Trapped. 35 years together. And that was the word Robert had chosen. Emily closed her laptop and stood. Anyway, thank you again for your time. As she walked toward the door, she paused. Oh, Robert and I are planning an engagement dinner soon. Just something small with a few friends. She hesitated for a moment. If the company gala isn't scheduled too soon, I'd love to invite some colleagues. Perhaps, I said politely. She smiled warmly and left the office. When the door closed behind her, the room felt very quiet again. Robert had told her a story about a failed marriage, a story about an unmotivated wife, a story about a man finally escaping to build the life he deserved. What he didn't realize was that every day the woman he had described so poorly was sitting in the office above the entire company his fiancé worked for, and sooner or later the truth was going to surface. The only question left was how. Over the next few weeks, Emily Parker's presence in my professional life became impossible to avoid. Not because she sought it out intentionally, but because she was very good at her job. The River District project was gaining momentum, and Emily's marketing strategies were becoming central to our rollout plan. Every department meeting included updates from her team. Every proposal involved data she had collected. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same name, Emily Parker. From a business perspective, I had to admit something that complicated matters even further. She deserved the attention. Her instincts were sharp. She understood emerging neighborhoods, shifting demographics, and how to present a development project in a way that attracted both investors and tenants. More importantly, she worked harder than almost anyone in the department. That kind of dedication always stood out to me, perhaps because I recognized it. For years, I had been the same way, quietly building something while everyone else assumed I wasn't doing much at all. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel Parker stopped by my office again. He didn't bother knocking this time. He leaned casually against the door frame. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "That usually means trouble," I replied. Daniel smiled. "Beatty, are you avoiding the promotion discussion because of Robert?" I looked up from the documents spread across my desk. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." Daniel stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "The executive board is meeting next week," he said. "They want a final decision about the River District leadership team." "I'm aware. And Emily is the top candidate." I folded my hands on the desk. "Her numbers support that." Daniel studied my face carefully. "I know you don't like mixing personal life with business," he said. "But you're still human, Kathleen. I'm also the majority owner of this company." "Yes," Daniel said, "which is exactly why I'm asking." There was a long pause. Finally, I sighed. "You want to know if I'm planning to sabotage her career?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I want to know if you're being fair to yourself." I leaned back in my chair. "This company wasn't built to settle personal scores," I said. "If Emily is the best person for the job, she gets the job." Daniel nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that." He walked toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing," he added. "I spoke with the marketing department this morning, and they think Emily is on track to become one of the strongest leaders in the company." I smiled faintly. "That's good news." Daniel gave me a knowing look. "Unless your ex-husband ruins everything." After he left, I sat quietly for a moment. Robert had no idea how much influence Emily's career held inside my company. He probably imagined she worked for some anonymous corporate structure, a distant CEO, a faceless board of directors, not the woman he had spent decades married to. That thought alone almost made me laugh. Later that evening, I received a text message from my son Michael. "Dad says he's moving in with Emily next month." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Michael had always been closer to Robert than to me, not because we lacked love, but because Robert's personality filled every room he entered. Michael had grown up admiring that confidence. After Robert left, Michael struggled to stay neutral. At least that was what he told me. In reality, neutrality often meant siding with the louder parent. I typed a short reply. "Is that what he wants?" Michael responded quickly. "Yeah, he says it's time to start his new life." New life. The phrase had become Robert's favorite, as if 35 years of shared history could be erased like a chalkboard. I set the phone aside and tried to focus on something else. But later that night, curiosity pulled me back to the company database. I opened Emily's latest performance review. Her supervisor had written something interesting. "Emily demonstrates strong leadership instincts and a willingness to take risks in competitive markets." That sentence lingered in my mind. Risk. Robert had always been drawn to risk. Big projects, bold moves, ambitious plans. Perhaps that was what attracted him to Emily. She represented the version of himself he still wanted to believe existed. The version that wasn't defeated by bankruptcy or middle age. A few days later, I saw Emily again during a project planning meeting. The room buzzed with conversation as executives discussed renovation budgets and tenant negotiations. Emily stood near the presentation screen explaining her latest marketing projections. "If we position the River District as a destination for young creative businesses," she said, "we can attract startups and boutique firms looking for flexible office spaces." Someone asked about competition from other developments nearby. Emily didn't hesitate. "That's where branding matters," she replied confidently. "We're not just offering offices, we're offering a community." Her energy filled the room. I watched quietly from my seat at the far end of the table. At one point, Emily glanced toward me. "Would you agree, Kathleen?" she asked. All eyes turned in my direction. I considered the data on the screen. Then I nodded. "Yes," I said. "You're thinking about this the right way." Emily smiled. After the meeting ended, she approached me while the others packed up their materials. "I appreciate your support earlier," she said. "You earned it," I replied. She hesitated for a moment. "You know, Robert actually suggested something similar last week." "Oh," I said carefully. He used to work in development, Emily explained, so he's been giving me advice about positioning the project. I felt a strange mix of amusement and disbelief. Robert offering strategic guidance about marketing a development project for a company owned by his wife. That's helpful, I said neutrally. Emily nodded enthusiastically. He's really smart about this stuff. Then she lowered her voice slightly. He's had a rough few years, though. I waited. His marriage ended recently, she said. He spent decades with someone who didn't really believe in ambition. The words hung in the air between us. I kept my expression calm. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Emily sighed. He says he wasted a lot of time trying to build a life with someone who was satisfied staying small. Satisfied staying small. I wondered what Robert would think if he could see the financial reports sitting in my office, or the property portfolios worth millions, or the development deals waiting to close. But he couldn't see those things. Not yet. Emily checked her phone. I should get back upstairs, she said. The marketing team is preparing the next campaign. As she turned to leave, she added one last comment. Oh, Robert and I are planning a small engagement dinner soon. I felt my pulse slow. Congratulations, I said politely. Thank you, she replied. Then she smiled. You should come. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard her correctly. To the dinner, I asked. Yes, she said brightly. You've been such a great mentor at work. It would mean a lot. The irony was almost unbearable. Emily Parker was inviting me to celebrate her engagement to my husband. I held her gaze calmly. I'll think about it, I said. Emily beamed. Great. She walked away down the hallway, completely unaware of the strange storm she had just stirred. Because if that dinner actually happened, Robert and I would be sitting across from each other again. Only this time, the power between us would be very different. The invitation sat in my mind for days. Emily Parker had asked me, her boss, to attend the dinner where she planned to celebrate her engagement to Robert Thompson, my husband, or technically my soon-to-be ex-husband. If anyone else had described the situation to me, I probably would have said it sounded like the plot of a bad television drama. Yet there I was, living inside it. For several evenings, I ignored the thought entirely. I focused on work. The River District project was moving forward quickly. Architects finalized renovation plans for the warehouses, investors reviewed financial projections, and city officials approved zoning adjustments. Business was thriving. Personally, though, things remained complicated. Robert had moved most of his belongings out of the house by then. The divorce paperwork was in progress, though lawyers warned it could take months to finalize. Strangely, I didn't feel the dramatic heartbreak people often describe after the end of a long marriage. What I felt was quieter. More like the slow fading of something that had already been dying for years. One evening, my phone rang while I was reviewing property reports. The caller ID showed Michael's name. Hi, Mom, he said when I answered. Hi, sweetheart. Michael hesitated before continuing. Dad told me something today. I closed the file on my desk. What did he say? He said Emily wants to invite some coworkers to their engagement dinner. My heart gave a small ironic twist. Yes, I said calmly. She mentioned that. Michael sounded surprised. She already told you. We work at the same company, remember? There was a brief pause. Right, Michael said awkwardly. Michael still struggled to understand the full scope of my work. Like Robert, he had spent years assuming my small craft business was my only occupation. I had never corrected that assumption. Now it was starting to create strange situations. Are you going? Michael asked. I looked out the window at the dark Chicago skyline. I haven't decided yet. Michael exhaled slowly. Dad thinks it would be uncomfortable. That made me smile slightly. I imagine it would be. He says the past should stay in the past. I leaned back in my chair. Your father has always preferred simple narratives. What do you mean? Nothing, I said gently. How are you doing? Michael sighed. It's been weird. Because of the divorce. Yeah, and because Dad seems like a completely different person. I waited. He's acting like he's 25 again, Michael said. Talking about starting new projects, making big plans. That sounds familiar. Emily seems nice, though, Michael added. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Yes, she does. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Robert chasing a new life. Emily believing she had found a man full of untapped ambition. Michael trying to understand both sides of a family breaking apart. And me, standing at the center of a truth none of them fully understood. 2 days later, Daniel Parker walked into my office again. He didn't bother with small talk this time. So he said, dropping into the chair across from my desk, "I heard you got invited to a very interesting dinner. News traveled quickly inside companies." I raised an eyebrow. "You've been talking to the marketing department again." Daniel grinned. "They talk to everyone." He leaned forward slightly. "You're going right. I haven't decided." "Oh, come on," he said. "You can't pass up a moment like that. I'm not interested in humiliating anyone." Daniel shook his head. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He folded his arms. "You've spent years hiding what you built. Maybe it's time the world sees it." I considered that. Revealing the truth at Emily's engagement dinner would certainly accomplish that. But something about the idea felt wrong. "I'm not looking for revenge," I said quietly. Daniel studied me carefully. "No," he admitted. "You're not." Then he smiled. "But the universe might be." That evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time the message came from Emily herself. "Hi, Kathleen. Just checking if you might be free Friday night for the engagement dinner." I stared at the message for a moment. Her tone was cheerful, friendly. She had absolutely no idea how complicated her invitation was. After a few seconds, another message appeared. "Robert would love to meet some of the people I work with." I almost laughed. Robert already knew some of the people she worked with. He just didn't realize it. I typed a short response. "Friday evening should work." Emily replied instantly. "Wonderful. I'll send you the address." A few seconds later, the location appeared. A small upscale restaurant near the Chicago River. Private dining room. 6 guests total. Small, intimate. Impossible to avoid conversation. I set the phone down slowly. For the first time since Robert left, I felt something close to anticipation. Not anger, not bitterness. Something closer to curiosity. Because Robert had created a story about our marriage. A story where he was the ambitious man who had been trapped for decades by an uninspired wife. Emily believed that story. Michael believed parts of it. And Robert had probably repeated it so many times that he believed it himself. But stories have a funny way of collapsing when confronted with reality. Friday evening arrived faster than expected. I stood in my bedroom staring at the closet. Most of the clothes inside were professional business attire, tailored suits, simple dresses, clothing appropriate for boardrooms and investor meetings. After a few minutes, I selected a dark navy dress I often wore to company events. Elegant, understated, confident. As I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she felt different. For years, I had allowed Robert to see only a small piece of who I was. The quiet wife, the woman with hobbies, the partner who stood in the background. Tonight would be the first time he saw the other version. Not through an argument, not through revenge, simply through truth. Before leaving the house, I paused in the doorway. 35 years of memories lived inside those walls. Family dinners, birthday parties, arguments, laughter. All of it now belonged to the past. I picked up my purse and stepped outside. The evening air was cool as I drove toward the restaurant. Chicago's city lights reflected across the river as traffic moved slowly through downtown streets. By the time I arrived, the sky had turned deep blue. Inside the restaurant, a hostess greeted me warmly. "Are you here for the Parker Thompson engagement dinner?" "Yes," I said. She led me down a quiet hallway toward a private dining room. Soft light spilled from the partially open door. I could hear voices inside. One of them was Emily's. Another voice made my stomach tighten slightly. "Robert." The hostess smiled politely and gestured toward the door. "They're just getting started." I nodded. Then I stepped inside, and for the first time since the night he walked out of our house, Robert Thompson saw me again. The moment I stepped into the private dining room, the conversation stopped. Not gradually, not politely, completely. 6 people sat around the long table covered with white linen and soft candlelight. Wine glasses sparkled under the warm glow of the chandelier, and a large window behind them revealed the dark Chicago River flowing quietly through the city. Emily Parker was the first to stand. "Kathleen," she said warmly, "you made it." Her smile was genuine, completely unaware of the storm she had just walked into. Robert, however, looked like someone had suddenly pulled the floor out from under him. For a moment, he simply stared at me. His face drained of color. "Kathleen," he said slowly. It was the first time he had spoken my name in weeks. Emily turned toward him, clearly confused. "You two know each other?" she asked. I set my purse down calmly on the chair beside me. "Yes," I said. Robert still hadn't moved. His eyes flicked between me and Emily like someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become very complicated. Emily laughed lightly. Oh, that's funny. I guess Chicago really is a small world. She gestured toward the empty chair across from Robert. Please sit down. I took the seat quietly. The room remained tense for several seconds. Emily looked around at the other guests. Everyone, this is Kathleen Hale, she said proudly. She's one of the senior executives at my company. Several people nodded politely. One man extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you as well, I replied. Across the table, Robert still looked stunned. Emily placed a hand gently on his arm. Robert, are you okay? He forced a stiff smile. Yes, I'm fine. But his eyes never left me. Emily continued happily. Robert used to run a construction company, she explained to the table. So he's been giving me advice about development projects. Someone asked him a question about real estate markets. Robert cleared his throat. Yes. I've worked in construction for many years. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was trying to understand how his ex-wife had suddenly appeared at his fiancé's engagement dinner as one of her company's senior executives. The story he had told Emily about me didn't include this version of Kathleen. Emily turned back toward me. I'm so glad you came, she said. You've been such a great mentor at work. Thank you, I replied calmly. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emily continued speaking. I've been telling Robert about the River District project all week, she said enthusiastically. Kathleen has been really helpful with my marketing proposals. The irony in that sentence almost made me smile. Robert finally spoke again. You work with Emily, he asked carefully. Yes, I said. For quite some time now. Emily laughed again. She's being modest. Kathleen is part of the leadership team. Robert swallowed. I see. The waiter arrived with menus, temporarily breaking the tension. As people began discussing food options, Emily leaned toward me slightly. You know, she said quietly, Robert never mentioned that he knew someone at my company. Robert looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I met his eyes briefly. Then I answered Emily's question. I suppose it never came up. The waiter returned to take orders. Wine was poured. The conversation slowly returned, though a strange tension lingered beneath every word. Robert barely spoke. Emily, however, seemed completely relaxed. She described upcoming marketing plans, talked about new tenants interested in the River District project, and laughed easily with the other guests. At one point, she turned to Robert again. You should tell them about that project you worked on in Evanston, she said. Robert nodded stiffly. Yes, that was several years ago. He spoke briefly about construction work he had supervised before his company collapsed. Listening to him describe those years felt strange. Not because he was lying, but because he was only telling half the story. He spoke about the success, the contracts, the growth. But he never mentioned the long nights Kathleen Thompson had spent balancing the books, or the sacrifices that kept the company alive during its hardest years. After the appetizers arrived, Emily lifted her wine glass. I'd like to make a toast, she said. Everyone looked toward her. She smiled warmly at Robert. Robert and I met at a time when we both needed something new in our lives. Robert forced a small smile. Emily continued. He spent many years in a marriage that didn't allow him to reach his full potential. I noticed Robert flinch slightly at those words. Emily didn't see it. He told me he felt trapped for a long time, she said. The room grew quieter. Robert glanced at me nervously. Emily raised her glass. But sometimes life gives you a second chance. She looked at Robert lovingly. And I'm grateful we found each other. Everyone clinked glasses. Everyone except me. I simply watched Robert. Because I knew something he didn't. The truth about my life. The truth about the company Emily worked for. And the truth about how fragile Robert's carefully constructed story really was. After the toast, dinner continued. Conversation drifted toward business topics again. Emily asked me several questions about marketing strategy for the River District project. I answered professionally. Robert remained mostly silent. Finally, about halfway through the main course, Emily leaned back in her chair. You know what's funny, she said. What one guest asked. I talk about work so much at home that Robert practically feels like he works for the company too. She laughed. Robert gave a weak smile. Emily turned toward me. You should see him when I explain our development plans, she said. He loves analyzing the business side. She paused for a moment. Actually, I think he'd be really impressed by the leadership team. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Oh, yes, Emily said enthusiastically. Our founders built something incredible. Robert shifted again in his chair. Emily continued. I keep telling him he should meet Daniel Parker someday. I nearly smiled. That might be interesting, I said. Emily nodded. And Kathleen, you've been with the company for years too, right? Yes, I replied. Robert's eyes moved slowly toward me again. How long? Emily asked. I looked directly at Robert as I answered. A long time. Emily smiled. You must really believe in the company. I do, I said calmly. Across the table, Robert's expression tightened because he was beginning to realize something. Something about the way people in the company spoke to me. Something about the way Emily looked to me for approval during meetings. Something about the quiet authority in my voice. The puzzle pieces were starting to move. He just didn't know yet how big the picture really was, and very soon he would. Dinner continued, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Most of the guests didn't seem to notice. They were enjoying the wine, the elegant food, and the lively conversation Emily kept guiding from topic to topic. But Robert noticed, and so did I. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward me, studying my face, as if he were trying to understand something that refused to make sense. I could almost hear the questions forming in his mind. Why was Kathleen here? Why did Emily treat her like an important executive? Why had he never heard about this before? Emily, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the silent battle taking place across the table. She had moved on to describing the company's upcoming gala event. It's the biggest night of the year for us, she said excitedly. Investors, partners, city officials, everyone comes. One of the guests asked where the gala would be held. At the Grand Hall downtown, Emily replied. It's incredible. She turned to me. You'll be there too, right? Of course, I said. Robert shifted in his chair again. Emily continued speaking enthusiastically. I'm hoping this year will be extra special, she said. The company is celebrating a major milestone. What kind of milestone? Another guest asked. Emily's eyes lit up. The founder of the company is receiving a major business leadership award. I watched Robert carefully. He was paying very close attention now. Who founded the company? One guest asked. Emily smiled. A brilliant investor named Kathleen Hale. The name hung in the air. Robert's eyes snapped toward me instantly. I took a slow sip of water. Emily continued, completely unaware of the tension growing beside her. She started the company years ago with a few small properties, Emily explained. Now we manage millions in real estate across Chicago. That's impressive, someone said. It really is, Emily replied. People say she's incredibly strategic. Robert looked like someone who had just heard a ghost story about a person he thought he knew. He stared at me again, longer this time. Emily leaned toward him affectionately. I keep telling Robert I'd love for him to meet her someday, she said. The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. Robert opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Emily noticed his silence. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, he said quickly. But the words sounded strained. One of the guests raised a glass. Well, I'd love to meet this Kathleen Hale, too. Emily nodded eagerly. She's amazing from everything I've heard. Then she turned back to me. Have you worked with her directly? The room suddenly felt very quiet again. I could feel Robert's attention sharpen like a knife. Yes, I said calmly. Quite closely. Emily leaned forward with curiosity. Really, what's she like? I met Robert's eyes again. She's someone who believes actions speak louder than appearances. Emily smiled. I like that. Robert's fingers tightened around his wine glass. He was beginning to understand something, but he still didn't fully grasp it. Emily continued talking. She built the company from almost nothing, she said. That kind of ambition is incredible. She glanced at Robert. Don't you think so? Robert forced a small nod. Yes, he said quietly. I suppose it is. Emily rested her chin on her hand thoughtfully. You know, that's one thing Robert and I have always connected on, she added. Ambition. I watched Robert carefully as she spoke. He told me he spent years feeling like the people around him didn't understand his drive. Emily continued. Robert's face tightened slightly. Emily kept going. But life is too short to stay somewhere you can't grow. Those words landed heavily in the room. Robert's eyes shifted toward me again, and for the first time that evening, I saw something new in them. Not arrogance, not confidence, doubt. The conversation drifted again when the waiter arrived to clear plates and bring dessert. But Robert barely touched his food. Finally, during a brief lull in the conversation, he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low enough that only I could hear it. What is going on? He whispered. I kept my expression calm. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Emily was laughing with the other guests across the table, completely unaware of the quiet exchange happening beside her fiancé. Robert's voice grew tighter. Why are you here? Emily invited me. That's not what I meant. I tilted my head slightly. Then what did you mean? Robert's jaw clenched. You work at her company. Yes. Since when? For quite some time. His eyes narrowed. You never mentioned that. You never asked. Robert leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to stay composed. Emily turned toward us again. Everything okay? She asked. Of course, I said smoothly. Robert forced another smile. Yes, just catching up. Emily seemed satisfied. Fadi. Good, she said cheerfully. Then she picked up her glass again. You know what would be fun, she said. What? Someone asked. If everyone here came to the company gala next month. Several guests nodded. That sounds interesting. Emily looked at Robert. You should come too. Robert blinked. Me. Yes, she said excitedly. You'd finally get to see the company in action. Then she turned to me. Do you think that would be okay? I smiled slightly. I'm sure it would. Robert looked like he had just stepped into a maze he didn't understand. Emily squeezed his hand. You'll love it, she said. Robert nodded slowly. Yes, I'm sure I will. But I could see the storm forming behind his eyes. Because the puzzle pieces were finally starting to fit together. He had heard the name Kathleen Hale. He had heard the story of the company's founder. And he had spent the entire evening watching his ex-wife behave like someone with far more authority than a simple executive. Sooner or later, Robert Thompson was going to ask the question he was clearly avoiding. And when he did, his entire version of the past 35 years would collapse. For now, though, dessert arrived. The other guests resumed laughing and chatting. Emily looked radiant. Robert looked haunted. And I sat quietly in the center of it all, waiting for the truth to catch up with him. By the time dessert arrived, Robert had barely spoken for nearly 20 minutes. Emily noticed eventually. Robert, she said gently, you've been really quiet tonight. He straightened slightly in his chair, forcing a polite smile. Just tired, he said. It was a weak excuse, and everyone at the table seemed to know it. Emily frowned with concern. You've barely touched your food. I'm fine, he insisted. Across the table, I watched him carefully. Robert had always been confident in social situations. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and quickly turn himself into the center of attention. But tonight was different. Tonight he looked like someone slowly realizing that the world he thought he understood was much bigger and much stranger than he imagined. Emily reached for his hand. You've been stressed lately, she said softly. Robert nodded absently. Yes, I suppose I have. One of the guests tried to lighten the mood. So Robert the man said with a friendly smile, Emily tells us you used to run a construction company. Robert looked up. Yes, for many years. What kind of projects? Commercial buildings mostly, Robert said. Retail spaces, small offices. That must have given you a lot of experience with development. Robert nodded. It did. The guest glanced toward me. Then you probably have a lot in common with Kathleen, he said. Real estate development isn't easy. Robert's eyes flicked toward me again. Yes, he said slowly. I'm starting to realize that. Emily laughed lightly. See, I told you the two of you would get along. She turned to me. Robert has been giving me great advice about the River District project. I folded my hands calmly on the table. That's good to hear. Robert swallowed. You're involved in that project, he asked. Very. Emily smiled proudly. It's one of the biggest developments our company has ever attempted. Robert shifted slightly in his seat. And you're leading it, among other things. Emily tilted her head. You didn't know Kathleen works closely with senior leadership. Robert hesitated. I didn't realize. How closely? Emily laughed again. Well, you should see the way people listen when she speaks in meetings. She turned to the other guests. Seriously, when Kathleen gives feedback on a proposal, everyone pays attention. Robert stared at me. There was no hiding the confusion on his face anymore. Because the woman he had described to Emily as unmotivated, unambitious, someone who stayed small, did not look like the woman sitting across the table tonight. The waiter returned briefly to refill glasses. Emily lifted her wine again. You know what we should do, she said suddenly. What someone asked. We should visit the River District site together sometime. She looked at Robert enthusiastically. You could finally see the scale of what we're building. Robert nodded slowly. That might be interesting. Emily turned to me. Maybe Kathleen could give us a tour. Robert's head snapped toward me. A tour, he repeated. Emily shrugged casually. Well, she's practically running the project. Robert blinked. I see. The room fell into another brief silence. Finally, Robert leaned toward me again. His voice was barely above a whisper. What exactly do you do at that company? I met his gaze calmly. A variety of things. That's not an answer. You never asked before. Robert exhaled sharply. Because you told me you ran a craft store. I told you I sold handmade products online. You let me believe that was your main job. You never seem very interested in the details. Robert's jaw tightened. Emily glanced between us again. Are you two sure you've never met before? She asked jokingly. We've crossed paths, I said. Robert forced a short laugh. Yes, something like that. Emily shook her head playfully. This city is smaller than I thought. The other guests chuckled, but Robert wasn't laughing. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the table as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Finally, he spoke again. You said the founder of the company is named Kathleen Hale. Emily nodded proudly. That's right. Robert slowly turned toward me. And your name is Kathleen Hale. I smiled slightly. Yes. Emily looked between us again, still smiling. Wait, are you related to her? Robert's expression froze. The room suddenly felt very still. I tilted my head thoughtfully. In a way, I said. Emily leaned forward with curiosity. How? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. Robert watched every movement, because now he understood something important. The answer to Emily's question mattered. A lot. Finally, I set the glass down. I know the founder very well, I said calmly. Emily's eyes lit up. That's amazing. Robert's hands clenched slightly on the table. Emily continued excitedly. You'll have to introduce me someday. I held Robert's gaze for another moment. Then I smiled gently. I'm sure that can be arranged. Emily laughed. Perfect. She leaned back happily. This has turned into such a great evening. Robert said nothing, but his silence was louder than anything else in the room, because now the pieces were almost all in place. He had heard the founder's name. He had watched the way people treated me. He had listened to Emily describe the company I had built. And somewhere deep inside his mind, the truth was beginning to form. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but he would be soon, very soon. Because the next major event Emily had mentioned, the company gala, was only a few weeks away. And at that gala, the founder of Hale and Parker Property Group would be standing on stage in front of hundreds of guests, accepting an award, under bright lights, where everyone could finally see exactly who she was, including Robert Thompson. After that moment, the dinner began winding down. Not abruptly, but slowly, like a gathering that had lost some of its energy without anyone fully understanding why. The other guests continued chatting, finishing their wine and complimenting the restaurant's food. Emily seemed happy with how the evening had gone. Robert, however, looked like a man carrying a question that refused to leave his mind. When the waiter brought the final bill folder, Emily waved it away quickly. Already taken care of, she said with a bright smile. One of the guests laughed. Engagement perks. Emily grinned. Something like that. The group began standing, gathering coats and purses. Emily hugged each guest warmly. Thank you all for coming, she said. The hallway outside the private room buzzed softly with other diners and quiet music. Through the restaurant's tall windows, Chicago's night lights shimmered along the river. As the group slowly drifted toward the exit, Robert hung back. I knew he would. He waited until the others stepped a few feet ahead before turning toward me. Kathleen, he said quietly. Yes. What is really going on? His voice carried none of the confidence he once used so easily. Only confusion, maybe even fear. I looked at him calmly. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, he said. He lowered his voice further. You're not just some employee at Emily's company. No, I said simply. Robert ran a hand through his hair, something he always did when he felt cornered. You let me believe. He began, then stopped. I tilted my head slightly. You believed what you wanted to believe. That's not fair, isn't it? Before he could respond, Emily's voice floated back toward us. Robert, are you coming? Yes, he called quickly. Then he turned back to me. We're not finished talking. I never said we were. We stepped into the cool Chicago night together with the others. Emily walked beside Robert, slipping her arm through his. That was wonderful, she said happily. I'm so glad everyone got along. Robert forced a smile. Yes, wonderful. Emily turned toward me. I really hope you'll come to the company gala next month. I'll be there, I said. Perfect, she replied. She looked at Robert. You should come too. Robert hesitated for a split second. Then he nodded. Sure. Emily clapped her hands softly. Great. It'll be your first time seeing how big the company really is. Robert glanced at me again. Yes, he said slowly. I'm starting to realize that. The group said their goodbyes. Cars pulled away one by one until only Robert and Emily remained standing near the restaurant entrance. Emily kissed Robert lightly on the cheek. "I'm going to grab the car," she said. She walked toward the valet stand, leaving Robert and me alone on the sidewalk for the first time that evening. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Finally, Robert spoke. "You're the founder, aren't you?" His voice was almost a whisper. I didn't answer immediately. Streetlights reflected across the river behind him, and traffic hummed softly in the distance. Robert took a step closer. "Kathleen Hale," he said slowly. "That's your maiden name?" "Yes." His eyes widened slightly. "So the founder of Hale and Parker Property Group?" "Yes." "Is you." I watched the realization settle across his face. All the assumptions he had built about my life were collapsing one by one. "You built that company?" he asked. "I did." "How long?" "About 8 years." Robert stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "That company owns half the River District development," he said, "and several other properties. But you were selling crafts online." "I was also investing." His voice grew sharper. "You never told me." "You never asked." "That's not the same thing." "No," I said calmly. "It isn't." Robert exhaled slowly. "You let me believe you were barely making money. I let you believe what you wanted to believe." "That's not fair, Kathleen." I looked at him carefully. "Do you remember what you said the night you left?" Robert's expression tightened. "You told me I had no ambition," I continued. "You said you deserved a better life." He didn't answer. "You said I was holding you back." Robert looked away toward the river. "I didn't know," he muttered. "No," I said. "You didn't." For years, Robert had believed he was the only ambitious one in our marriage. He had believed I lived quietly in his shadow. He had believed I depended on him. Now he was realizing something very different. Emily returned at that moment, walking toward us with the car keys. "Ready?" she asked cheerfully. Robert quickly composed himself. "Yes." Emily smiled at me again. "Thank you for coming tonight." "It was my pleasure." She opened the car door for Robert. As he climbed inside, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no anger in them now, only shock, and something else, regret. The car pulled away into the city traffic. I stood on the sidewalk watching the red taillights disappear down the street. The truth had finally reached Robert Thompson, but that was only the beginning. Because in a few weeks, at the company gala, the entire world he thought he understood was about to see the truth as well, and that moment would change everything. In the days following the engagement dinner, something shifted, not inside the company. Business continued moving forward exactly as it always had. Meetings were held, contracts reviewed, construction schedules adjusted, and tenants negotiated leases for the River District development. But outside the office, the quiet storm that had started that night continued to grow. Robert knew the truth now. He knew that Kathleen Hale, the founder of Hale and Parker Property Group, was the same woman he had been married to for 35 years. And for the first time since our separation, he began reaching out. The first message came 2 days after the dinner. I was sitting in my office reviewing investment projections when my phone buzzed. "Robert." For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. I answered. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Kathleen." His voice sounded different, less confident than usual. "Yes, I think we need to talk." "We've already talked." "Not really." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want to discuss?" Another pause. "That company," he said finally. "You mean the one you built?" "I didn't hide it," I replied calmly. "You never told me. You never asked." Robert exhaled slowly. "I don't understand why you kept it from me." I looked out the window toward the Chicago skyline because I knew how you would react. "What does that mean?" "You spent years measuring your worth by success," I said. "You had already lost your company. I didn't want you to feel like you had lost your pride, too." Robert was quiet. Then he spoke again. "So you protected my ego." "I protected our marriage." Robert laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "That's ironic." "Why?" "Because I left that marriage believing I was the only ambitious person in it." His words hung in the air. "That belief didn't come from nowhere," he added. "You created it." "No," I said gently. "You chose it." Robert didn't respond for several seconds. Finally, he spoke again. "Emily doesn't know yet. I assumed she didn't. She thinks you're just a senior executive." "That's what I am." "You're also the founder." "Yes." Robert sounded uneasy. "She talks about you all the time." "That's flattering." "She admires you." "That's good for the company." Robert's voice grew quieter. "She admires the kind of ambition she thought I had." I didn't respond, because we both knew what he meant. Emily believed Robert had escaped a life where his dreams were ignored. But the truth was much more complicated. You should tell her, Robert said finally. Why? Because she deserves to know. Does she? Robert hesitated. You think she'll find out at the gala anyway? I imagine so. Hundreds of people will be there. Yes. And you'll be on stage. That's usually how award ceremonies work. Robert sighed heavily. You're enjoying this? No, I said. I'm simply not hiding anymore. The call ended shortly after that, but Robert's voice stayed with me long after I hung up. Because beneath his confusion, I could hear something deeper. Regret. Not the loud dramatic kind. The quiet kind that appears when someone suddenly realizes they misunderstood the most important person in their life. 3 days later, Daniel Parker stopped by my office again. You look thoughtful, he said. I've been thinking about the gala. Daniel smiled. It's shaping up to be quite an event. Investors confirmed, all of them. City officials, 2 council members, and the mayor's office. Daniel sat down across from me, and our guest list just got even more interesting. Oh! Emily Parker confirmed she's bringing her fiancé. I nodded. I expected that. Daniel watched me carefully. You realize what that means, right? Yes. Robert would walk into a ballroom filled with hundreds of people who knew exactly who Kathleen Hale was. The investors, the developers, the city leaders, the employees, everyone except him, and Emily. Daniel leaned forward. You could tell her before the gala. I could, but you're not going to... I folded my hands. She deserves to hear the truth. From you. No. Daniel smiled slightly. From reality. The truth had never been about revenge. I didn't need to humiliate Robert. Life was already doing that on its own. Later that afternoon, I received another unexpected message. This time from Emily. Hi, Kathleen, quick question about the gala. I replied, of course. A moment later, her message appeared. Do you think it would be okay if Robert attends with me? I smiled faintly. He already plans to. Her response came instantly. Really, he didn't tell me that. He mentioned it at dinner. There was a short pause before the next message. He's been acting strange since that night. How so? He keeps asking questions about the company and about you. I considered my response carefully. What kind of questions? About how long you've worked there? What your role really is? I typed slowly. Curiosity is natural, Emily replied with a laughing emoji. True, but he looks nervous. Nervous. That word stayed with me after the conversation ended. Robert Thompson nervous. The man who once believed he controlled every room he entered. Soon he would walk into a ballroom filled with people who knew exactly who I was. And he would realize something he had never considered before. The woman he dismissed for lacking ambition had built a world he had never even seen, and that world was about to welcome him, publicly. The night of the company gala arrived faster than I expected. Every year, Hale and Parker Property Group hosted a formal event to celebrate new developments, thank investors, and recognize employees who helped the company grow. But this year felt different. This year, the company was celebrating a major milestone, and I was receiving the Chicago Business Leadership Award for Real Estate Development. The event was being held in the Grand Hall downtown, a large ballroom known for its tall marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and wide windows overlooking the city lights. By the time I arrived, the entrance was already busy. Black cars lined the curb. Valets hurried back and forth. Inside, hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Developers, city officials, investors, architects, employees from every department. Many of them greeted me warmly as I walked through the room. Kathleen, congratulations. Well deserved. You've built something remarkable. I thanked them politely, but my attention kept drifting toward the entrance, because I knew Robert would arrive eventually. And when he did, the truth would finally become impossible to ignore. Daniel Parker joined me near the stage about 20 minutes before the program began. You look calm, he said. I feel calm. Impressive, he replied. If I were about to watch my ex-husband discover I secretly built a multi-million-dollar company, I'd probably be more dramatic about it. I smiled faintly. I'm not here for drama. No, Daniel agreed. You're here for recognition. The lights dimmed slightly as the evening program prepared to begin. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. And then I saw them. Robert and Emily walked into the ballroom together. Emily looked elegant in a dark green dress, her hair styled carefully for the formal event. Robert wore a black suit, but his posture was tense. The moment they stepped inside, Emily's eyes widened. "Wow," she whispered, looking around the massive ballroom. "I told you the company was big," she said to Robert. Robert didn't answer, because he was looking at the banners hanging along the walls. Large banners displaying the company name, Hale and Parker Property Group, and beneath the name, a photograph. My photograph. Emily didn't notice at first. She was busy greeting coworkers who approached them, but Robert saw it immediately. I watched his face from across the room. The moment he recognized the photo, the moment his entire body stiffened, Emily turned toward the banner a few seconds later. "Oh," she said happily, "there she is." Robert didn't move. Emily smiled proudly. "That's the founder I told you about." She pointed toward the photograph. Kathleen Hale. Robert's face went pale, because the photograph above the ballroom floor was unmistakable. The same woman he had been married to for 35 years. The same woman he had told Emily lacked ambition. The same woman he believed had been holding him back. Emily kept talking. "She built this entire company from scratch." Robert's eyes moved slowly across the room until they found me standing near the stage. Emily followed his gaze. "Oh, good," she said brightly. "There's Kathleen now." She waved excitedly. I raised my hand politely in return. Emily turned back to Robert. "Come on," she said. "I want to introduce you properly." Robert didn't move. Emily frowned slightly. "What's wrong?" Robert swallowed. "That's her." Emily blinked. "What?" "That's Kathleen." Emily laughed softly. "Yes, of course, I just said that." Robert shook his head slowly. "No, that's Kathleen Thompson." Emily stared at him. For a moment, she didn't understand. Then the realization began to form. Her smile faded. "Wait." She looked back at me, then back at Robert. "You mean?" Robert nodded weakly. "Yes." Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's your ex-wife?" "Yes." Emily turned toward the banner again. "The photograph." "The name." Kathleen Hale. Her boss. Her mentor. The woman whose leadership she admired. The woman whose company she worked for. The woman Robert had described as someone with no ambition. Emily's expression shifted rapidly between confusion and disbelief. "That's not possible," she said quietly. Robert said nothing, because the truth was standing only 30 feet away from them. At that moment, the host of the evening stepped onto the stage. The microphone echoed softly through the ballroom. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." The room grew quiet. "We're honored to welcome all of you to tonight's annual Hale and Parker Property Group Gala." Applause filled the room. Emily and Robert remained frozen near the entrance. The host continued. "Tonight, we celebrate not only the success of this company, but the vision of the woman who started it all." The spotlight turned toward the stage. "Please join me in welcoming the founder of Hale and Parker Property Group." A brief pause. Kathleen Hale. The applause grew louder. Hundreds of people turned toward the stage, and I walked forward. As I stepped into the light, I could see Robert and Emily standing near the back of the ballroom. Emily's eyes were wide with shock. Robert looked like a man watching the final collapse of a story he had believed for years, because in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The woman he had left for lacking ambition had built one of the most successful real estate companies in the city, and everyone in that room knew it. Everyone except him. Until now. The applause in the ballroom lasted longer than usual. Not just polite clapping, but the kind of recognition that comes from years of watching something grow. Investors stood. Several employees cheered from the back of the room. Even some of the city officials near the front tables nodded with quiet respect. From the stage, the lights were bright enough that I couldn't see every face clearly, but I could see two of them, Robert and Emily. They stood near the entrance of the ballroom like two people who had just stepped into the wrong room. Emily's hand was still holding Robert's arm, but her posture had changed. She wasn't smiling anymore. Robert looked like someone who had suddenly realized that every assumption he had built his life on was wrong. The host continued speaking beside me. For nearly a decade, Kathleen Hale has quietly transformed the Chicago real estate landscape, he said into the microphone. Starting with a handful of small properties, she built Hale and Parker Property Group into one of the fastest-growing development firms in the region. More applause. I stepped forward to the podium as the award was handed to me. For a moment, I simply looked out over the crowd. So many faces. Employees who had worked late nights on renovation projects. Architects who had redesigned old buildings into something new. Investors who had believed in my vision before it was proven. And somewhere in the back of the room, the man who had once told me I had no ambition. I adjusted the microphone. "Thank you," I began. The room grew quiet again. This company started in a very small way, I said. A single property, one renovation, one opportunity to prove that something overlooked could become valuable again. My eyes moved briefly toward the back of the ballroom. Robert and Emily hadn't moved. I learned something important during those early years, I continued. Success rarely comes from loud promises. It comes from patience, from persistence, from showing up every day and doing the work even when no one is watching. Several people nodded. I could see Emily listening carefully now, because every word carried a new meaning for her. I was fortunate I continued to build this company with people who believed in that same philosophy. I glanced toward Daniel Parker near the front table. People who understood that real growth often happens quietly. The audience applauded again. But my speech wasn't really about real estate. Not entirely. There's another lesson I learned along the way, I said. The room grew even quieter. Sometimes people misunderstand the value of something simply because they haven't taken the time to look closely. A few people exchanged curious glances. Emily's eyes shifted toward Robert. Sometimes I continued the most important work someone does isn't obvious from the outside. My voice remained calm, but that doesn't make it any less real. Robert lowered his gaze. Emily looked between us again, her expression slowly shifting from confusion to understanding, because she was starting to realize something. The story Robert had told her about his marriage wasn't the full truth, and maybe it had never been. I finished my speech simply. Thank you to everyone who believed in this company, and thank you to the people who continue building it every day. The applause returned again, loud, warm, genuine. As I stepped away from the podium, several people approached the stage to congratulate me. Daniel was the first. Well, he said with a grin that was elegant. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. You didn't need to be. He nodded toward the back of the room. They got the message. I followed his gaze. Robert and Emily were still standing near the entrance, but now they were talking. Not casually, intensely. Emily's face had lost all of its earlier warmth. Robert looked like a man trying to explain something that had already collapsed. After a few minutes, Emily turned away from him and walked quickly toward the exit. Robert remained standing there alone. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then he started walking toward me. Daniel noticed immediately. Here we go, he said quietly. Robert approached slowly, stopping a few feet away from the stage. People nearby recognized him from the dinner earlier that month and stepped aside. Robert looked up at me. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain about what to say. Kathleen, he said. Yes, you built all of this. Yes. Robert looked around the ballroom. The employees, the investors, the banners with my name, the awards still resting on the podium. You never told me, he said quietly. I didn't hide it. You let me believe you were small. I studied his face. You decided that yourself. Robert shook his head slowly. I thought I knew you. You knew the version of me you paid attention to. Robert looked toward the exit where Emily had disappeared. She didn't know, he said. No. She thought you were just her boss. I am. He ran a hand through his hair again. That speech, was that about me? I smiled faintly. It was about many things. Robert's voice grew softer. I made a terrible mistake. Perhaps he had. But the moment for that realization had come too late. I looked at him calmly. Good night, Robert. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say more, but nothing came out. Finally, he nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. As he disappeared through the ballroom doors, the band began playing again, and conversation slowly returned. Daniel leaned toward me. Well, he said that's one way to close a chapter. I watched the doorway for another moment. Yes, I said quietly. It is. The night of the gala didn't end with a dramatic confrontation. There were no shouting matches, no public scenes, just the quiet collapse of a story Robert had believed for years. After he left the ballroom, the evening continued the way events like that usually do. Music returned, people laughed, investors discussed future projects over glasses of wine, employees gathered around tables sharing stories about late nights on construction sites and difficult negotiations that had finally succeeded. Life moved forward, and strangely that felt right. Daniel stayed near me for most of the evening, occasionally whispering sarcastic commentary about the shocked expressions he had noticed earlier. At least Robert finally learned something tonight, he said at one point. What's that? Never underestimate quiet people. I smiled slightly. The truth was, I didn't feel triumphant. Relieved perhaps, but not triumphant. Because the truth hadn't been revealed to punish Robert. It had simply been revealed because it existed. By the time the gala ended, most guests had already heard the story. Not the dramatic version Robert had told Emily, but the real one. The founder of the company had once been married to a man who believed she lacked ambition, and that man had discovered the truth in the middle of the company's largest celebration. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When I finally returned home that night, the house felt quieter than usual, but it didn't feel empty anymore. For years, the silence had carried the weight of things left unsaid. Now it simply felt peaceful. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. Sunlight filled the kitchen as I made coffee. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Michael. "Mom, we need to talk." I replied, "Of course." An hour later, he arrived at the house. Michael looked nervous when he stepped inside. He sat at the kitchen table, glancing around the room as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I went to the gala last night," he said, finally. "I know. You didn't tell me. I assumed you'd hear about it eventually." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "Dad called me afterward." I waited. He sounded different. "How so? Like someone who just realized something big." "That didn't surprise me." Michael looked down at the table. "He told me about the company." I nodded. "I built it quietly." Michael looked up at me. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question wasn't angry, just confused. "For the same reason I didn't tell your father," I said. "I didn't want my success to become something anyone felt threatened by." Michael shook his head slowly. "You thought we'd feel threatened. Your father might have. And me. You were young." Michael leaned back in his chair. "For years, I thought Dad was the ambitious one," he said. "He wanted you to think that." Michael sighed. "He said he feels like an idiot." I took a sip of coffee. "That's something he'll have to process on his own." Michael hesitated before asking the next question. "Are you going to forgive him?" Forgiveness. It's a word people use easily when they aren't the ones who experience the mistake. "I'm not angry anymore," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were." Michael nodded slowly. "That makes sense." He sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. Emily broke up with him. That surprised me slightly. "When?" "Last night." Michael rubbed the back of his neck. She told him she needed time to figure out what was real and what wasn't. That too made sense. Emily had believed she was entering a relationship built on shared ambition. Instead, she discovered that the story she had been told wasn't accurate. Michael stood and walked to the window. "You know what's strange," he said. "What?" "I think Dad really believed the story he told her." "That's possible." Michael turned toward me again. "He believed you were small." I smiled faintly. "People often see what they expect to see." Michael nodded thoughtfully. Then he walked back to the table and sat down again. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words meant more to me than any business award. "Thank you," I said. Michael looked around the kitchen again. "You built an entire company," he said quietly. "Yes, and you did it without anyone noticing." "That wasn't the goal." "But it happened." I nodded. "Yes." Michael smiled slightly. "Well, I guess the secret's out now." It was. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The divorce papers were finalized quietly. Robert moved into a small apartment across the city. Emily remained with the company, though our conversations became more formal and professional. She worked hard, and I respected that. Daniel continued expanding the company's development projects, and for the first time in many years, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. Not the dramatic kind people imagine after divorce, but the quiet freedom that comes from finally living without being misunderstood. Robert had once believed I lacked ambition, but ambition isn't always loud. Sometimes it builds something remarkable while no one is watching. And sometimes the truth reveals itself at exactly the right moment. For 35 years, Robert believed he understood the woman he had married. He believed he knew her strengths, her limitations, and her ambitions. But the truth was far more complex. Sometimes the people closest to us see only what they expect to see. They overlook quiet determination. They misunderstand patience as weakness. They mistake humility for a lack of ambition. Kathleen didn't build her success to prove anyone wrong. She built it because she believed in something larger than appearances. And in the end, the most powerful moment wasn't the public recognition at the gala. It was the quiet realization that her value had never depended on someone else's opinion. So here's a question for you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew you well? And if so, how did you respond? Did you try to prove them wrong? Or did you simply keep building your life quietly until the truth revealed itself? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear your story. And if this story resonated with you, Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge. They're about discovering your own worth.